Idaho, of course, has its share of natural disasters, droughts, floods, wildfires, even earthquakes. But 26 years ago, a small Idaho community was struck by a devastating mudslide. And now that town doesn't even exist anymore.
A lot of people may not know about this. And today, meteorologist Jim Duthie takes us back several years for a look at that little town and the destruction that occurred when a mountainside just gave way nearly a generation ago. He says a similar disaster could happen again.
This stretch of Highway 55 north of Horseshoe Bend, winding along the beautiful Payette River, is one of the most scenic drives in southwest Idaho. Most of us traveling between Boise and McCall along this route don't even realize that there used to be a little town here. But that all changed 26 years ago, on New Year's Day, 1997. The Payette River cuts a narrow canyon as it winds from the mountains to the valleys below. And the same geological forces that helped shape this river canyon are still at work today. At the junction of Highways 55 and 17, and where the North Fork joins the main Payette River, sits a little spot called Banks, which used to be known as Upper Banks. 2 miles to the south, there's a wide pull-out area along the highway, and that's where the community of Lower Banks used to sit. There was a motel, a cafe, a gas station, and an RV park, as well as a handful of houses and trailers. December of 1996 brought a snowy start to winter, with heavy snow piling up in the mountains like we saw this last December. Then on Christmas Eve, the weather pattern started to change. Unusually warm air and heavy rainfall streamed into Idaho from down around Hawaii. Temperatures pushed into the 50s and 60s, and all of that heavy snow started to melt rapidly. And in fact, many locations were seeing flooding already across southwest Idaho as rivers began to flow out of their banks. The ground couldn't hold any more water. And for the little town of Lower Banks, a catastrophe was about to unfold. On New Year's Day, the mountainside above Lower Banks collapsed with what sounded like a dozen freight trains, according to one eyewitness. Hundreds of tons of mud, rocks, and water roared down the slope across Highway 55, slamming into Lower Banks and burying the Trails End Motel. Mud 7 feet deep swept into buildings, carrying huge boulders and trees. Residents, workers, and customers ran for their lives. Fortunately, no one was hurt or killed. Across the highway, the thick, oozing mud filled houses and knocked trailers off their foundations. It buried cars, trucks, and campers. Power lines were knocked out, along with phone lines and the town's water supply. Highway 55 was left impassable. But Lower Banks wasn't the only community hit by floods and mudslides. All across Idaho, high water and mudslides closed highways and devastated communities. The Weiser River rose 7 feet above flood stage, swamping much of the town of Weiser. In Adams County, the raging Weiser River cut a path of destruction through Midvale, forcing people out of their homes. And floodwaters poured over Black Canyon Dam at Emmett. Idaho was cut in half, as the only north-south routes, Highways 55 and 95, were unusable. In addition, Highway 21 from Idaho City to Lowman and Idaho 17 from Garden Valley to Lowman also suffered major damage from mudslides and flooding, leaving many communities isolated and cut off from the rest of the world, including McCall and Cascade, Lowman, Garden Valley, and Crouch. But while these towns eventually got back to normal, Lower Banks never recovered. Because of the geological hazard and the threat of ongoing landslides, Lower Banks was eventually condemned and deemed too dangerous for property owners to go back to. And now there's hardly any trace that the town of Lower Banks ever existed. It took more than 2 weeks for Highway 55 to reopen. 6 months later, a July thunderstorm triggered another mudslide, closing the road again. But by then, Lower Banks had been abandoned. Zach Lifton, a hazards geologist with the Idaho Geological Survey, says these locations and many other places throughout Idaho continue to be under the threat of landslides.
The geology, especially along Highway 55 and parts of Highway 95, tends to be pretty prone to landslides and debris flows because it's made up of what we call Idaho batholith granite, which sounds like it's a good solid rock, but it's been fractured and weathered quite a bit. So there's a high potential for erosion there. Along Highway 55 in particular, it's really steep. So the river has cut down a pretty steep canyon, and so that slope, that gradient of elevation, is really important for landslides. I can say almost certainly these things are going to continue to happen.
Lower Banks doesn't exist anymore, but there are plenty of places throughout southwest Idaho that could experience a similar fate as Mother Nature continues to do what she's been doing for millions of years. From where Lower Banks used to be, I'm Jim Duthie for Idaho's News Channel 7.
And record rainfall on top of deep snowpack led to the flooding and those mudslides, and up to 4 times the normal December and January rainfall was observed. That's nearly a foot of rainfall at Garden Valley.
Wow. Now, because roads were closed for extended periods, emergency food and medical supplies had to be flown into isolated communities. While in McCall, stranded holiday visitors were lining up the airport there for any available seats back to Boise since they couldn't drive home.
Can you imagine?
Unbelievable.